Welcome to Axiom's Edge with Andy KLINE. You know, the question of whether Islam is compatible with liberal Western values comes up often in the media, especially after the religion of peace demonstrates its rejection of such liberalism by shooting up gay nightclubs or massacring cartoonists just for doing their job. And after such horrible incidents occur, the Islamist apologists always pop up into the media to explain why Islam has nothing to do whatsoever with the tragedy that just occurred. When questioned if liberalism and democracy is compatible with Islam, they always hail Indonesia as the holy exemplar of how Islam undeniably is. It's their slam dunk put away argument to prove that Islam and democracy can coexist to produce a successful Muslim country. Well, in this episode, we're going to focus on that very question. Is Indonesia really an example of a successful Muslim country? Are they right? Do they really know what they're talking about? Have they actually kept up with the news or even been to Indonesia? And sorry, vacationing on Bali doesn't count. Well, I heard it again recently on Real Time with Bill Maher as Bill was yet again confronted by good-intentioned yet ignorant guests screaming about something they obviously know nothing about: Islam in Indonesia.
Britain
When I'm talking about
diverse.
our fundamental principles like equality of women,
Right.
separation of religion and state, respect for minorities, rule of law,
Right.
as opposed to religious rule.
Do you know about the Westboro Baptist Church? There are a whole bunch of fundamentalists.
Again, this false equivalency.
It's not a false
Matt,
equivalency
please.
whatsoever.
I'm going to hurt your
Like
reputation
the
by helping you.
Baptist
You're about to tell-
Church
you're about to tell me that I
See,
need
I'm
to
from
raise
Kansas.
my
I'm
voice
from
in a thing
Kansas.
of
I know
men.
what that is.
Oh, my
Look,
God.
we have to call things as they are. And
Thank
look, there
you.
are a lot of moderate Muslims who know
Yes, there
that
are.
Islam,
Oh.
Wait a second.
Islam
Yes.
is in a fight
Absolutely.
for the idea
Let's
that you
stick
can
up
have. Let
for
me finish.
them.
That you can have a civilization where you have religious pluralism. They themselves,
Absolutely.
those Muslims, don't believe in that religious
So,
pluralism.
Matt, will you tell me this? Will you tell me
Those
this?
extremists.
Can you explain to me the structure of the government of Indonesia?
I can't.
Okay.
Well, I can. Not only have I lived in Indonesia for 6 months, admittedly not a lengthy stay by some accounts, but I am married to an Indonesian, and half my relatives are Indonesian, and I even have a son who was born there. Now, out of love and respect for my wife and her family, yes, they are Muslim, I got married in Jakarta. But it wasn't as easy as just performing a ceremony, reciting some hocus-pocus words, and offering a dowry. Yes, they still do. They keep it old school in Indonesia. So what was my dowry? I don't mind telling you. I gave her 3 treasured gifts for peace of mind, body, and soul. For peace of mind, I gave her the promise of my everlasting, unconditional love. For body, a shiny, glittery rock as promise insurance. And for the metaphysical soul, a copy of Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great. I'll let you decide which is the most valuable. But there's a problem. Although Indonesia is claimed by the apologists to be such a successful Muslim country that honors diversity and tolerance, for some reason, interreligious marriage is illegal. That is, if the couple comes from different religious backgrounds or from none at all, one has to convert to the other. And if you're an atheist, well, sorry, you're not even recognized. Atheism has been left off the marriage menu. So I married a Muslim after declaring I would never convert to any religion as it was and still is against my core principles. But I caved. But hey, love makes us do crazy things, right? So right away we have religiosity dictating the norms of what is supposed to be a democratic country where everyone is represented. What is democratic about being forced to convert to a religion against your will? That sounds like something they would do in a theocracy to me. But okay, if it keeps mother-in-laws happy, maybe it is for the greater good for world peace, because as my brother-in-law said, quote, if I don't convert, it's going to be World War III, unquote. First, in order to determine if Indonesia is a successful Muslim country, we need to define successful. I've never heard the Islamist apologists such as Bill Maher's guest define what constitutes a successful Muslim country. And I don't want to put words in their mouth, but because the apologists I routinely hear this from are Western, I'm going to assume that their standards are Western. Okay, so let's start by looking at what most consider the biggest determiner of a country's success: money, money, money. According to TradingEconomics.com, Indonesia is ranked as the 41st most competitive country out of 138 worldwide. That's not bad. However, a study by Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade said approximately 73% of the market capitalization value of publicly listed companies, that's excluding foreign and state-owned, were owned by Chinese Indonesians. Additionally, they own 68% of the top 300 conglomerates and 9 out of 10 private sector groups. This figures propagated the general belief that ethnic Chinese, then estimated at 3% of the population, controlled 70% of the economy. That's 3% of the population controlling 70% of the country's economy. Well, another report cited in Indonesia, the Chinese are regarded as hardworking and enterprising. One housewife from Eastern Java told the New York Times, quote, "They work harder. In a Chinese family, you see the mother working, the kids working, everyone's working. Sometimes we feel jealous. We think, why are we Javanese below the Chinese?" Unquote. Well, the Chinese have traditionally kept a low profile so as not to arouse too much resentment over their wealth. Most rich Chinese don't like to flaunt their wealth out of fear of upsetting the Muslim majority. Okay, so who are the real Indonesians? This begs the question, first, who are these Chinese? Are they from Taiwan or Shanghai, Hong Kong, or Beijing? No, they aren't referring to mainland Chinese coming over to start businesses in Indonesia. These are Chinese Indonesians, meaning that they are Chinese by ancestry but born and raised in Indonesia. However, they are not viewed as pure Indonesians, which is why they are referred to by their ethnicity. So no matter how many generations your family has lived in Indonesia, if you have a different ancestry, you're not thought of a real Indonesian. Sounds, I don't know, kind of racist. And this stuff matters beyond the playground. This is played out in their democratic process to the extreme. As we see in the runoff election of the governor of Jakarta, Basuki Ahok, a Chinese Indonesian who squared off against his Muslim rival, Anies Baswedan. Ahok is the incumbent, and more controversially to conservative Muslims, is not only ethnically Chinese, but even worse, he's a Christian. And because he worships a different invisible dictator than the Muslims, he has been the target of bigotry and hate on a scale not seen since the days of Sukarno. Ahok is also the unfortunate recipient of a fatwa ordered by the Indonesian Ulama Council, or MUI, which is a very conservative Muslim group. The government, by the way, turns to the MUI for guidance on matters concerning religion and moral conduct. Well, on October 11, 2016, the Muslim People's Forum, or FUI, accused Ahok of misusing the Quranic verse Al-Ma'idah 51. Ahok said that people should not believe Islamic leaders who claim it forbids Muslims from being led by non-Muslims. He has since repeatedly apologized for this statement, although I don't know why, but his apology has had about as much effect as speaking logically to a social justice warrior. Since he made that statement in September 2016, Ahok has been prosecuted at least 14 times, defending himself against Indonesia's blasphemy law, and has even served time in jail. According to the Jakarta Post, the leader of Ulama Council, or MUI, Ma'ruf Amin, in court, said he stood by the council's issuance of Ahok's fatwa, though he admitted he never watched the whole footage of the speech in question. Beside Amin was Jakarta General Election Commission Commissioner Ibnu Baskaro, a National University of San Diego, USA graduate who was one of the 3 that reported Ahok to the police. You know, Ibnu would have made a great SJW at San Diego if he wasn't one already. Well, the national movement to safeguard Indonesian Ulama Council's fatwa, yes, that's the name of the movement, used the MUI's edict to rally support from mainstream Muslims and press the police for prosecution. Note the key word in that sentence: rally support from mainstream Muslims for prosecution. So these Muslims who want to prosecute the governor aren't a small minority, they appear to be the norm. Maruf told the court that the police had asked the MUI to determine if Ahok committed blasphemy. Well, let's examine this blasphemy law a little before going on, as I think it deserves some further attention. The blasphemy law, which was written by authoritarian President Sukarno in 1965, is hardly an ignored piece of legislation. Since being on the books, more than 200 cases have been prosecuted and a grand total of 1 acquittal. In fact, this law is so readily enforced, in 2012, a man named Alexander An of Sumatra was convicted of blasphemy for declaring on Facebook that he's an atheist. How dare you not believe that angels live in beards, or that there's an invisible God who can create the grandness of the cosmos but can't stomach the thought of pork consumption, or that jinns run around the desert like a bedeviled Bugs Bunny because they have nothing better to do for eternity other than fuck with people. How dare you think skeptically and disbelieve claims that bear no evidence whatsoever? Okay, so what's the maximum penalty for blaspheming in a successful Muslim country? A small fine? What, community service? A mandatory course in suicide bombing? What? No, it's actually 5 years in prison. Alexander the Atheist, however, got off easy. He only received 2.5 years in prison for posting on Facebook. In his ruling, it was said that the declaration of being an atheist was offensive to Islam. What isn't offensive to this so-called religion of tolerance? Look, if you're so easily offended by someone who doesn't share the same unsubstantiated belief as you, maybe you're not ready to function in a democratic society. Because in a democracy, everyone is to be represented. Everyone. In a democratic society, you're not the only person who matters. You have to put up with others' BS just as we have to put up with yours. But unlike most democracies, Indonesia does not separate church and mosque from state. As it turns out, it's the government that turns to the MUI, the conservative Islamists, for guidance in governing. I mean, here you are really dangerously playing on the teeter-totter with the fat kid of theocracy who has your butt hanging in the air. And someone who doesn't believe in supernatural nonsense offends you? If I can just say as an atheist, I'm offended by some religious people. Not only do we have to put up with the religious bullying, but every day we have to read about the atrocities of what the parties of God are doing in the name of their favorite fairy tale. You know, it offends me that the Islamic holy book, Al-Quran, in chapter 8, verse 22 says, quote, "For the worst of beasts in the sight of God are the deaf and dumb, those who understand not." Okay, so I am the worst thing in the world for not believing vast claims that hold no evidence. In fact, according to the Quran, I'm even less than human. But you know, maybe the Quran is right. After reading verses like this, I definitely don't feel smart. If someone wants to believe me and other non-believers are less than human, fine. I would never think of jailing them or doing worse because of someone's held belief. It's called tolerance, something many conservative Muslims claim to have, but provide little evidence of possessing. I guess their tolerance is like their religious certainty. Both only exist in their mind. Okay, back to Alexander the Atheist. Should declaring one an atheist really merit the downfall of your life? If you think what I just said was overdramatic, either you've spent too much time in prison or you're woefully unaware of the repercussions of being an over 30 atheist blasphemer in a so-called successful Muslim country. Let's unpack what this man will have the misfortune of enduring simply for revealing who he is. Not only does Alexander the Atheist have to go to prison in what I would consider the prime of his life, but in Indonesia, if you are over 30, you are considered old. And I don't mean the you should be married with 3 wives by now. Yes, polygamy is lawful in Indonesia. I'm talking about, oh, you're over 30? Sorry, we don't hire people as ancient as you old bastard. You see, most companies in Indonesia have a maximum hiring age of under 30. That's right, you're considered over the hill at 30, and job recruiters have no use for you. That means when this poor guy leaves jail, not only will he be labeled a criminal and a heretic, he will be unemployed with little hope of finding economic security. Just for declaring to be an atheist on Facebook. This is outrageous. Where is his hashtag? Hashtag Free Alexander the Atheist. Seriously, is this the Muslim success story we're told to believe in? If you think so, you're holding Muslim country standards well below Western. Or maybe your standards of success just need some serious reevaluation. Okay, getting back to the governor's race in Jakarta. Aho, the incumbent Christian Chinese Indonesian, a 2-time loser to millions of conservative Indonesian Muslims, who has been arrested on this blasphemy charge, has not only been prosecuted 14 times and jailed, but he has also seen 3 widespread demonstrations of more than 50,000 people inciting Jakartans to not vote for him. Hey, I support protests, but these aren't protests because the guy's been a terrible governor while in office. In fact, he's done a lot of great things. These are hate rallies, plain and simple. At these demonstrations, organized by the Muslim People's Forum, along with other radical Muslim groups, the whole city shuts down, and they start with a mass prayer. However, I guess 2 of the things the Muslims that attend these protests forget to pray for are civility and peace, as after prayers, the burning of property and Aho effigies light up the riotous night. So anyone who's going to compare American Christians who stand out there with their God hate fags placards, equating it to the same kind of intolerance, this is where you're wrong. A placard is an annoying sign, often with misspelling by the unevolved primate who thinks the Bible dropped out of the sky and into Jesus' hand in one big high five. In addition to their mass protests, burning, effigies, prosecutions on bullshit blasphemy charges, these nutbags litter the city with hate signs inciting the same Quranic verse Aho is being accused of blaspheming. Their signs incite so much hate and intolerance, they have to be removed by the police. But the party doesn't stop with the signs, because when it comes to really getting the message across, mere words just don't cut it. For an example, a sign can't scowl at you, or glare at you menacingly, or chase after you with a knife if you reject its message. No, the hardline Islamists need boots on the ground to make sure you understand the message loud and clear. And by the ground, I mean the ground at the polling stations. Now there are reports of voter intimidation that would make Tony Soprano blush. A large mass movement called the Al-Maidator has cast lingering fear among voters, especially with another hard-ass Muslim group, the Islam Defenders Front, or FPI, who is expected to join the movement. The Al-Maidator is named after a verse in the Quran that is often used by conservative Muslim political groups to urge Muslims to vote only for Muslim candidates. Now, some will say that before JFK, all US presidents were Christian, though I would disagree because it is quite clear that the likes of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, if they weren't atheists, were probably deists. Much of their writings, like many of the founding fathers in America, were awash with religious skepticism. Jefferson wrote how he despised both the religious institutions and especially the priests. Here's one of my favorite quotes from Jefferson. Quote, "My opinion is there would never have been an infidel if there never had been a priest." Jefferson doesn't sound like he's got too much love for Christianity. But let's just say they were Christian, and the argument is made that Americans are just as intolerant in their selection of a political leader when it comes to religion. But here's what's different. Al-Ma'idah Tour's goal is to employ at least 1 million people who could monitor all 13,032 polling stations in the capital. That's 1 million people monitoring 13,000 polling stations. The leader of Al-Ma'idah Tour, Farid Panaman, said, quote, "Beside trained volunteers, we will also deploy our top members at each polling station." I wonder what you would have to be willing to do or believe to be considered as a top Al-Ma'idah Tour member. This open-minded and tolerant group is also asking its men volunteers to wear white attire and, of course, the all-alluring, fashionable, full black attire for women. Because, it's hot as hell in Jakarta, and why should the men suffer wearing the color that attracts the most heat? In addition to wearing a black tablecloth, both men and women are to recite Quranic verses and takbir, praise to Allah, at their assigned polling stations. I don't know, it sounds like a perfectly functioning democracy to me. Well, according to many Jakartans, surprisingly, due to the name and nature of the movement, people are afraid that the Al-Ma'idah Tour could intimidate Muslims into not voting for incumbent Jakarta Governor Basuki Ahok. But Farid assures us his intimidation techniques are for the sake of fair play. Well, that's certainly reassuring. Farid has denied accusations that his movement is aimed at supporting Anies win the election, and that his team has even contacted Anies so that they would not overlap in the field or, be seen together. However, Anies' team has claimed to be unaware of the Al-Ma'idah Tour movement. Okay, let's take their word for it and believe that they weren't aware of this movement, even though millions of other people apparently were, prior to being questioned about it. Well, they are now. And have they disavowed or disassociated themselves from these radical Islamic groups, the FUI, Al-Ma'idah Tour, Islam Defenders Front? No. Not condemning them or simply not saying anything makes them complicit with their actions. So you have this religious revolution going on with this election, but it goes further than just a hostile runoff between a Muslim and a Christian. At the same time, this holy battle is challenging Indonesia's quasi-secular constitution and winning. The Constitutional Court recently ruled to curtail the central government's authority to revoke regional bylaws, those are regulations made by a local authority, which will likely embolden local politicians to issue more religiously inspired regulation that are often discriminatory against women and minority groups. That's according to human rights activists. Here we see religious conservatism and all the anti-liberal bias that comes with it creeping further into the political mainstream, which of course affects people's daily lives. Add the growing trend of identity politics with the central government's inability to revoke problematic bylaws, and you get local lawmakers enacting theocratic law to boost their popularity. The Jakarta Post reported a 2015 survey conducted by the Center for the Study of Islam in Society that Sharia-based laws were passed by local politicians who bowed to demands from conservative Muslim groups in exchange for votes during the elections. Unsurprisingly, those who care more about human rights than living under Sharia aren't too happy. The executive director of the Institute for Criminal Justice Reform said, quote, "It is possible that the ruling may also lead to a more excessive implementation of the existing discriminatory bylaws." Before, a bylaw revocation was handled by the Home Ministry, but now can only be filed to the Supreme Court. National Commission on Violence Against Women chairwoman Adriana lamented the court's ruling. She said, quote, "The mechanism to scrap bylaws issued by the Home Ministry, if implemented effectively, is actually the most effective way to get rid of hundreds of discriminative bylaws across the country," unquote. Data from the women's organization reveals that from 2009 up to August 2016, a total of 421 discriminatory bylaws were issued by local governments, including those that regulate morality and restrict women's control of their own bodies. Okay, so there are Christian lobbyists that try to enact laws in line with Christian doctrine, but as always, the Islamists go one step further. And in this case, changing secular laws to the horrible laws of Sharia, erecting hate speech signs, orchestrating voter intimidation, and insisting on the governor's incarceration for blasphemy just wasn't enough. It seems some extreme Muslim groups felt the only thing that would suffice in getting what they want would be nothing short of overthrowing the government. Recently, the Jakarta police revealed their preliminary findings following the arrest of 5 treason suspects, including the leader of the Muslim People's Forum, FUI, Muhammad al-Khattab, prior to a rally in the capital. Al-Khattab, who was the anti-Ahok rally coordinator, big surprise, was arrested at the Kempinski Hotel in central Jakarta just hours before the rally took place. Besides al-Khattab, the other 4 suspects are all senior members of various Muslim organizations. According to the investigation, the Muslim groups hell-bent on taking over Indonesia needed just 3 billion rupiah, that's 225,000 USD, in funding to execute their treason plot. All the detainees have been charged with treason, which carry a maximum sentence of life. Now, you would think that these Muslim groups may just feel a tiny bit of shame or regret that their leaders had been nabbed by the police and charged with treason. You might expect other group members to come out and say, hey, they acted alone and do not represent our group as a whole. But that didn't happen. Because in Islam, it is a religious duty for Muslims to bring on or support the caliphate, and millions of Muslims really believe that. They've devoted their whole life to it. Only the apologists living in a bubble do not believe that they believe this. And that only hastens the death of liberalism. I mean, Muslims already control Indonesia, so what else, if not a theocracy, do they want? Well, the National Movement to Safeguard the Indonesian Ulama Council's fatwa held a press conference and told us what they want. They want the police to let the accused traitors set free. Maybe so they can coup themselves out of the horrors of secular liberalism. You know, the great Satan of earth. But perhaps what the Islamic apologists mean when they call Indonesia a successful Muslim country is the reference to its democratic government. However, first maybe they should check with the actual Indonesians before speaking on their behalf. For starters, I think the hardcore Indonesian Muslim religious groups, who the government depends on for so-called moral clarity and policy decisions, would strongly disagree. In 2005, the MUI, remember this is the group the government turns to for religious, moral, and political advice, the MUI issued an edict outlawing secularism, pluralism, and liberalism, considering them to be Western values that were not compatible with Indonesian society. But these Muslim hardliners' democratic intolerance isn't just reserved for the living. Even after death, they're not going to let you rest. That's because a number of Muslim clerics have launched a campaign to deny proper burial rites to deceased Muslims who had voted for Ahok. If you think bakers not baking sweets for gay weddings was intolerable, this really takes the cake. However, I guess some could make the argument a funeral and a wedding are one and the same. But if you think all intolerance is equal, that's where you're wrong. Cakes and people are not equal. Holding a grudge against the deceased and disrespecting their lifelong devotion to Islam is bordering on mental illness. This is why it is absolutely necessary for Islam not to be excluded from criticism. And by the way, any religion that demands special treatment not to be criticized or questioned is subconsciously making a plea to do so, because it has something to hide. Okay, but let's hold off on the commentary for a moment and go to the main source of Indonesian democracy and hear from the main man, the steward of Indo-democracy, the head chief honcho, the president of Indonesia himself. What does President Jokowi think of democracy? Well, in his own words, Jokowi said, quote, "Many people have asked me if democracy has gone too far. My answer is yes, it has," unquote. Think of the reaction from the left if Donald Trump said those words. We'd live in a bottomless pit of Hitler comparisons thrown at us for the rest of our lives. Bill Maher, who I love, no disrespect, Bill, but he'd be frothing at the mouth and throwing a hissy fit, declaring, "We live under a supreme dictatorship," and perhaps rightly so in doing. But as brash as this statement is, how much attention does it receive in Western media? Hardly any at all. Because it goes against the mainstream narrative that many people are sick to death of hearing. The kind of diatribe that loses US presidential elections to the most unfit, unwise, dangerous, and unqualified candidate ever to have run for the office, that Islam is absolutely compatible with a liberal democracy. I would argue it may be, but probably only for a limited time. In fact, I would say that there's a compelling case to be made that it's not compatible with a liberal democracy, as Islam has its own government system written in its traditions, and it ain't one that's democratic or liberal. President Jokowi also accused, quote, political freedom, unquote, of paving the way for extreme political practices. Well, one of the groups he directed this statement towards was the religious. But extreme Muslim groups reject and rail against political freedom altogether. They've made it very clear they want Indonesia to become a theocracy. Jokowi also leveled that accusation at secularists. But one of the key functions of secularism is to keep religious tyrants and whack jobs in check. Political freedom is at the heart of democracy. Without it beating, democracy dies, and what you get is a country like North Korea. Jokowi's distrust of democracy doesn't end there, though. He has also cited rampant hate speech and the spread of hoaxes as the result of, quote, deviant practices of democracy, unquote. But rather than demonizing his own system of government, which is responsible for him landing the job as president, why doesn't Jokowi just enforce the law against those conducting acts of intolerance or terrorism? If he prosecutes the religious bullies, freedom of expression doesn't need tampering with. But maybe he's too intimidated to do so. An opinion piece by Tobias Basuki, researcher at the Center of Strategic and International Studies for the Jakarta Post, in response to Jokowi's statements, wrote, "Liberalism is often associated with Western thought and is deemed, quote, not Indonesian, unquote, by many conservative thinkers." Where are the cries of xenophobia from the apologists? If someone in the West said this, particularly about Islam, I'm willing to bet they'd instantly be called a xenophobe or an Islamophobe. And of course, the irresistible, "You're a racist." He goes on to write that liberalism is also not necessarily something many Indonesian leaders and politicians think as being compatible with Indonesia. He goes on to state that the reality and roots of Indonesian society is much too complex to adopt liberalism. Basuki concludes that in the end, Indonesia may not yet be ready for liberalism in the Western sense. He paraphrases Ralph Waldo Emerson. Does anyone see the irony in paraphrasing a Western liberal when making their point on how Indonesia doesn't need liberalism? Anyways, he writes, Indonesia may not need to necessarily go where the path leads. It can go instead where there is no path and leave a trail. It can consolidate a democracy with its own natural fabric. But can all the fabric be considered equal without liberalism? I would argue that you need a secular country in order to ensure religious tolerance for all religious and non-religious groups. If you don't have one, the majority religion will surely dominate and oppress, as evidenced by modern Indonesia. There are powerful conservative Muslim groups like the MUI who would love nothing better than to dispose of democracy and replace it with a Middle Eastern-style Islamic theocracy. In a tradition like Islam, where it is nearly impossible to criticize or question, much less leave the faith if you want to, it seems like an improbability Indonesia can reject liberalism and thrive as a country. Personally, I find it amazing that after all the fear, intimidation, and acts of alleged treason, these groups are still allowed to exist. That's telling how much absolute power they have. I know many people will compare these Muslim religious groups to horrible racist organizations like the KKK and say they are the same, but they're not. The KKK's days of lynching and killing are thankfully over. Why? Because they were criticized, challenged, and exposed for what they are thanks to political freedom, the very thing President Jokowi disavows. We despise Jim Crow laws and rightfully call them out to be some of the worst of America's past. With more bylaws being enacted on local levels, Indonesia is establishing its own Jim Crow laws against women and minorities. And the KKK was and still is a small minority of ignorant bastards. They weren't given the role of advisors to the American government for moral, religious, and political guidance. These Muslim groups and their bigoted followers are not a small minority by any means, and they have real power. And note that it is only the conservative Muslims that behave like this, make religious and political demands, intimidate, issue fatwas, and imprison governors. There are a sizable Christian and Hindu populations in Indonesia, but we see none of this nonsense from them. They and the other minorities are held hostage and forced to put up with this religious hatred every day. Indonesia is a great case study for what Islam does to a democracy when it's in the majority. We don't need to hark back to the Turkish Empire to contemplate what it was like when Muslims were in the majority. We see it today in Iran, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan. We see a promising democracy in Indonesia flirting with theocracy because of extreme Muslim groups with too many political privileges and too much influence. If you let them change the laws in favor of Sharia, anything resembling secularism will be diminished. One thing's for sure, with the reduction of the government's ability to revoke regional bylaws, we can expect to see more Sharia and less liberalism. Therefore, it is not unrealistic to think Indonesia could slip into a Middle Eastern-style theocracy rather than remaining an Asian democracy. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it's not unthinkable. There is certainly a strong movement trying to make it happen. At some point, Indonesia is going to have to confront its identity crisis in a very honest discussion with itself and decide once and for all if they are going to embrace liberalism or Sharia. Having it both ways divides, is unsustainable, and is not a long-term solution. So returning to the original question, is Indonesia a successful Muslim country? Yes, of course, to some degree, but it also comes up dramatically short if you're comparing it to liberalism and tolerance found in the West. And the Islamic apologists who frequent the media and shout out how Indonesia is an example of a Muslim success story should not speak on behalf of Indonesians. As we've learned earlier, many Indonesian leaders and citizens are extremely skeptical and reluctant to embrace, if not outright reject, liberalism. Indonesia is a very conservative country. Conservatives by nature do not embrace liberalism. That's what makes them conservative. And I don't mean conservative like Southern America or in the cornfields of Iowa. In those places, you can say you're an atheist without fear of retaliation. You can leave your religion without fear of retaliation. You can find a strip club and overpay for a lap dance without being accused of being an infidel. American conservatism and Indonesia are nowhere close to being the same. All conservatism is not alike. Indonesia looks to have an interesting, if not rocky, road laid out ahead of it, regardless of the Jakarta election results. With emboldened religious bullies, the increasing adoption of Sharia, and the perpetual threat Islamic teachings and traditions pose that can easily be used to justify a theocratic transition, Indonesia will always be under the stress test to withstand gravitational pull into the hellfire of theocracy. Sometime in the not-too-distant future, the people of Indonesia will have to look in the mirror and decide which they would rather live under: a democracy that leans towards liberalism, that values freedom of speech and expression, fair and equal treatment for all, and a real tolerance for diversity, or conservative Muslim values that deny the former. The next couple of decades will be the most telling of Indonesia's success.